Before we begin working on our extremely detailed trees, we first need to take a look at the problems with some of the existing species and why they sometimes don't work for close-up renders. I'm going to go ahead and load in just our maple tree, and we're going to take a look at it and see some of the reasons why it's not very realistic when you're close up. Because of course most of these species are intended for ecosystems, and I'm just going to make some changes to our atmosphere editor and some of our lighting just so we can see this tree a little bit better. And we'll go ahead and brighten this up just a bit. And I'm just going to make a quick render so we can take a look at our tree. One thing you notice as this is rendering and starting to come up, we can see that the planes that our leaves are connected to are very flat, and what can happen a lot of the times is when we reach certain angles, if you notice down here in the lower left, since it's flat, those leaves will basically disappear. Also, we don't have the ability to curl our leaves individually, and they're all connected to that main plane for our sets of leaves. If we take a look at the individual polygons and how our leaves are generated, they're connected to an image map that we can see with our bark connected directly to it and the branches. And that also means that the branches and stems connecting our leaves to the tree are not three-dimensional. And now, with the native trees, our resolution is a bit lower for the maps. You could always create higher resolution maps. And in Advanced Custom Plant Creation 2, I showed you how you can make really high resolution, highly detailed, advanced maps for faking the depth of branches and creating really neat and high-resolution trees for mainly ecosystems. But now I want to focus on really showing how we can make a tree for closer-up renders that we can really get into, and the animation of the leaves will be more realistic. If we take a look at the polygons on this tree, because our leaf fluttering is all linked to each individual polygon, when we have animation turned on, these entire groups of leaves will be moving together, which will take away from some of the realism. Of course, these do work fantastic for farther away renders, and for ecosystems, it's basically something we have to use. But if we're working with individual plants closer to the camera, we can still use the solid growth technology and still use ecosystems, but not in the same sense we would normally use a tree like this. And another thing that can also take away from the realism is the amount of leaves that are on the tree. If we take a look at the concentration and the density of all of these leaves, there really aren't very many, and they're not in little groups cascading like they would be realistically. And even if we were to add more leaves onto the image map, if we go ahead and open up the plant editor and take a look at the image map, we could add more leaves to that image, but it is still linked to that one plane, and you end up seeing a lot more of those main leaf polygons when you do that. And then those groups will really stand out, and you'll see very sharp edges on the sides of your tree. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this maple tree, and we're going to start working on the plants and modifications we need in order to make a highly realistic tree. I'm going to right-click to load in a plant on our plant icon, and we're going to go to the plants folder for our native species that come along with View, and we're going to be using the Aurelia. So we can go ahead and click on that and click OK. And now what we're going to be creating is groups of leaves to use for our tree. And with this species and this plant, we have cascading leaves and three-dimensional branches. And when we animate this, each one of these individual leaves is going to move independently of each other, so you don't have large groups of leaves all with the exact same movement, which you can really take down from the realism. And we'll be able to use this onto a tree and create some very realistic looking renders. And with the technique I'm going to show you, we're going to have a lot of control over the placement of these individual species and the placements of our leaves. So we're going to create a couple of different variations of this plant to cover different parts of our tree. So we can double click to open up the plant editor, or you can right mouse click and go to Edit Object, which will also open up the plant editor. And the first thing I want to do is select in our trunk and branches subsets, select our trunk, and I'm going to decrease the diameter. We go ahead and zoom in. We can see this main trunk in the center. I want to scale down the diameter of that so it's not too thick. And I'm also going to select our stems and just decrease the diameter of those as well. And now I want to load in our image for our leaf before I make any changes to the polygons on our leaves, and that way we can have a really good idea of exactly how this is going to turn out. And I'm going to use the material editor for this. So if we have our plant selected, we can go up to the upper right, go over to our second material, which is going to be our leaf. Go to Color and Alpha, and we can right mouse click on the image to edit the function and open up the function editor. And I'm going to go ahead and load in a couple of plants, or a couple of leaves from the leaves collection. Using maple number 1, load in our color map. I'm going to go ahead and rotate this around 180 degrees to match the placement of our existing leaf so it connects correctly to our existing plant. We can load in our clip map, rotate that around as well, and then I'm going to add in another projected texture map, and we're going to create a bump out of the advanced bump map that's included with this. Go ahead and flip it around and connect our bump to the grayscale output. Click OK. And I'm going to move over to the Highlights tab, and we're going to increase the highlight intensity to around 22%. We're going to make it a little shinier. If you go back into our bump, I'm going to edit our filter and just turn on the curves, which will make the higher areas, or the white areas, a little more intense, and then the darker areas more towards the dark side. So basically it's just a way to increase the contrast without really having to edit the filter. And that's going to pull up a lot of those high points. And I want to take our depth and change that to 0.4. And if we take a look at the highlight, we can see our preview, whether or not we'd like it to be a little bit brighter. Let's go ahead and bring that up to 30%. And then I'm going to go back into the function editor and make sure that for all of these leaves that we have the interpolation type on, and I'm going to set that to bilinear for all of our different maps. And that's going to improve the quality of our renders and also the speed, and mainly the edges once we get really close to the plant, and make sure that MIP mapping is on, which you can see the checkbox for right here in the lower right, just underneath the preview and next area. Go ahead and click OK, and OK again, and now we can start to see those maple leaves showing up on our plant species. So we can double click to open up the plant editor once again, and now I am going to increase the scale of these leaves. And because of the way this plant is designed, our width will have to be slightly different from the length, also because of the shape of our image map, in order to get that to look correct and proportionate. And now what I want to do is adjust some of our other subsets. We'll go to stems, and I'm going to adjust the fall off, pulling it inward, and that way we can close up that area on top a little. And we could also gnarl it a little. We could change the droop setting. And it looks like we will need to adjust the width and the length a little to get some good proportionate leaves throughout the plant, because it might change slightly in different areas. We can see on the bottom we have a really wide one. Go ahead and pull that down. And we also want to click on this little leaf underneath our preview so that we can move our anchor point and our hooking point down to the bottom stem and click OK. And that way our stems are going to connect directly to the 3D stems that we have. And if you have an image without a stem, what you can do is just set that hooking point to where the stem would actually connect to the leaf and not necessarily where it is on the image. And we could adjust the length of our stems to pull that inward a little bit more. And now we're going to take a look at the flexibility and the curl. And we can go ahead and pull our curl down a little, and we can increase the flexibility to bend them down. We can even go over the preset value and the max for the slider, which is 100. So if we put that to 150, we can make them bend down a little bit further. But I think in this case 100 should be okay. We can click OK. And these are going to be the plants we're going to be using for the top parts of our branches, and mainly towards the top of the tree. We go ahead and create a render of that and just take a look. If we needed to, we could increase the quality of our bump map, maybe smooth it out a bit, but really a lot of this is being caused just by the lower render quality that I have. If we had texture filtering on, this would look much better. But overall this should work fairly well. There is one more modification we need to make before we save out the species. So I'm going to double click, and in the plant editor, if we go up to the top, we have a response to wind section. And right now our sensitivity of the trunk and branches and the leaves are set to 1. Well, what I want to do is take our leaves and turn that down to 0.1, and then our trunk and branches we can also bring down to 0.1, and that way they have a very small influence because they're a very small plant. And if you're working with a larger scene, there's less modifications you will have to make to other plants in order to get it to animate correctly. You could also have your trunk slightly lower than the leaves. So if we went and changed this to 1.5, then we'll have more leaf fluttering. Because a lot of that is controlled by the global wind options. I'm going to go ahead and stick with this, 0.1 for our trunk and branches, and 0.15 for our sensitivity of leaves to the breeze. And now, right next to that, we have a load plant and save plant species. We want to make sure we're saving out the species. And if you really want to make this more realistic, you could also load in an actual trunk or bark material for the main stem. But a lot of this is going to be really small and you're not going to see it anyway. So we don't have to have that type of trunk on there. And I'm just going to leave the default material. I do want to make sure, however, before I save this out, that I go into the material editor and change the name to maple leaf and then upper. And in Advanced Custom Plant Creation 2, I show how to create double-sided leaves so that when you're looking at the leaf from the top, you can have one type of depth, and from the underneath it could be a little brighter, a different bump map, and a lot more realistic. So you could always set that up as well using those techniques from that training. Open back up Plant Editor, and now we can save the species out. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we can start working on the other two. And after that save, we can use the same plant to make our other variations. And what we want is some coverage on our branches a little bit lower and more erratic. So what I'm going to do is go over to the left and select our trunk, and we can droop that down, or we can change our angle. And that's going to bend our plant a little more and have that kind of coming off the side. We could also modify both of our subsets together and adjust the angle of our stem and droop. I'm going to increase the gnarl. We just want to make sure that our leaves are still cascading and that everything looks realistic. But mainly what we're modifying right now is how we want gravity to react onto our side leaves and small clusters of them. We could adjust the randomness, modify the curl or the flexibility. And this should be okay. Just that slight bend. If you need to modify that more, you can always just droop that down. So then we can go ahead and save another species out for this one. And then now we can work on our third. And what we could do is really adjust the angle and the droop and have a plant in sets of leaves that are hanging down. And then what we need to do is basically reverse our flexibility and curl so they're moving the other way and cascading correctly. We could also adjust the gnarl amount, make some modifications to some of our settings, but mainly we want this one to really be hanging down, and it'll look a lot more realistic. Make a quick render of that so we can take a look. And it doesn't look too bad. So I'm going to go ahead and save that out as well for our third variation. And making sure that every time if you were to create a new plant and grow another one, that you go to your wind options and set those to the same as the other ones, because every time you select to grow a new plant, it will overwrite your wind settings. So if you save a new plant species, then those wind settings will be correct when you're populating an ecosystem with those plants. So now that those three are done, I'm going to go ahead and load in the plant and the tree we want to use to create our maple. And I'm going to be using one of the asileFX plants, the white oak, which is based on the black oak species, or actually I think it is called the white oak through cornucopia. And this is just a modified version that we had created. It's available on the Cornucopia 3D site. But one thing I like about this species is it has a lot more branches on it, which is what we really need for this effect. The native maple tree may not have enough branches coming off in order to really make this a realistic effect. So first I'm going to select our plant, right mouse click, edit object, and because of our bark texture we have on this, it is really dark and we can't see it in the editor. But that doesn't matter right now because the default that I have for this in the branch layout should be good enough. I just want to make sure that I'm removing the length and the width from our leaves so those do not show up in the OpenGL, although they may still render slightly when we render out the object. So we do need to go to our material for the leaves And I'm going to go to the Transparency tab and just turn off Variable Transparency and click OK. And that way those leaves will not show up at all, and they will be entirely based on the leaves we're about to set up and the plants we just created earlier. So now I have our species selected, and I'm going to double click on the bark. And in this case I'm using a mixed material to basically remove tiling. I'm just going to change this to a simple material and get rid of that extra variation that we have. Change our diffusion to 60 and our ambient to 40. That might make the bark a little lighter, but we can always go back and change that a little later. And I'm also going to change our scale up to 1. And now we can start adding in our leaves to our tree. So I'm going to select our first layer, our main layer, and select Ecosystem, which is now going to give us the ability to populate ecosystems on our branches. And that way all of our plants are going to connect correctly to this object and really give us a very realistic looking effect. So we can select Add Plant, and now I have the variations I created earlier, the top, the mid, and then the lower. And I've actually created 2 different lower sections that are slightly different. And we're going to start with our top and click OK. And it just needs to prepare the ecosystem and load in those high-resolution image maps that we have for the leaves. You don't necessarily have to use such high-resolution maps, but I do want to be able to go very close into our plant and leaves for our renders. And I want to go over to the Environment tab and just make sure that our altitude range and slope are set all the way to the highest value. I'm going to go to the Density tab and increase our overall density to 100% and turn off Decay Near Foreign Objects and click Populate. And now what we want to take a look at is just the overall scale of these objects and whether or not they are matched correctly to the size of our tree. And the OpenGL billboard view of our ecosystem can be sometimes difficult to see what's going on. So I'm going to zoom out from our tree, turn on full quality near camera, and change the radius to 3 meters. And the reason I zoomed out first was the default is 20 meters, and because our camera was so close it would have to load in all of those OpenGL polygons, which can sometimes slow down the system. But if we zoom out first, then we can just move our camera in and just focus on the smaller sections. So now we can see these sets of leaves showing up on our branches, and proportionately they look like the scale is alright and is going to match quite well for this. Now one thing you're going to notice is that we don't have full coverage of our tree, because using this method, the density at 100% will not fully cover all of the branches because of the different size variations. What we can do is set a couple of different options and change a couple things to actually fully populate the tree. One thing that we have is the forced regular alignment of instances under the density. And what that's going to do is basically rotate and turn all of our plants to kind of face mainly the same direction, at least in their original placement. But that's not going to affect this because we have so many different variations, and you can see that that already filled in a lot of the tree. Now another thing we can do is oversample our tree. Instead of using a max value of 100% for our overall density, we can actually increase that higher than 100% just by typing in the value. So I'm going to set this to 500% and click Populate, and now we can see a very dense tree with all of those different instances showing up. And if we zoom in, we can see our full OpenGL preview of all of these leaves. And now they're all kind of facing the same direction, And what I do want is a little bit of an angular variation. So if we open back up the material editor, I am going to change this density right now to a lower amount because we are going to be working on the other layers for the other plants we designed. So we'll bring that back down to the default of 100% as max. And if we go to scaling and orientation, we have a couple of different options. Our rotation is one option, which we can set how we'd like our plant to rotate and its maximum rotation value. Right now it is only going to rotate on the up axis. Well, I'm going to set this to all axes. And now we have more of a bend in our different plants. Throughout the tree, we can also select the direction from the surface, whether or not we'd like it to go vertically or perpendicular to our surface. And sometimes these values you'll have to play around with to get what's going to look correct for which part of the tree you're working on. Set this back to vertical. And we could increase the maximum rotation to 180. And this one can also be oversampled. Set it up to 360. And because we are just working on the up axis, you really don't see that. We'll set it to all axes, and we can see the leaves will start to bend down. But because we made this specific plant for the upper parts of our tree, we're going to set that to up axis only and just populate that. And that should be good. And we're going to move on and start working on the other types of leaves we want to cascade down from our tree. So I'm going to add a layer, and we can just exit out of the material chooser, turn on ecosystem, and then delete that layer. You could also go back to your main layer and just check ecosystem, which will add another ecosystem layer. But I find that sometimes I will run into problems with that. So sometimes it's just easier to add a new layer. So now we want basically the same settings. We're going to add in a plant, and this time I'm going to select the mid that we created, which was the second one. Let that load in, and we're basically just going to copy over our settings from the previous layer over to this layer. So with a scale of 1, increase our density to 100%, make sure we turn on force regular alignment of instances. Scaling orientation, we can leave those where they're at right now until we really see how this is going to turn out. And if you go to the Environment tab, you can see that our altitude range has been changed, so we do want to bring that down to -1 and click Populate. And we can start to see those new branches showing up. Of course, they're all blending in with our other branches, so one thing we can do is go to our previous layer, select General, turn off Full Quality Near Camera, and under our default quality, select None. And that way we can only need to focus on the new layer we are working on and our mid branches, which are spread out a lot more because of the way we had that curvature set and the gnarl amounts. And that way we don't have each of the plants really sticking up very high, and we can rotate them a lot more without losing quality. I'm going to zoom out, set Full Quality Near Camera, change that to 3 meters, and we can zoom back in to see the full quality effect. And in this case, it looks like maybe our leaves are a little too small compared to our other set of leaves, so we can always increase the scale. But I want to have a little bit of variation, so I'm going to keep this at a scale of 1. For our scaling and orientation, I am going to change the rotation to all axes, repopulate, and now we have some nice curvature and bending. Increase our maximum rotation to 180, and now we can zoom in. And by using the all axes, it will sometimes make your leaves appear in the wrong places, kind of upside down. Usually such a small amount of the leaves compared to how many there are total on the tree that it won't be very noticeable. We could also change to perpendicular or more towards vertical. I'm going to leave it around 23%, and that should be good for right now. And now we're going to load in that last layer. So we're going to add a layer, exit out just like we did before, change that to an ecosystem, then delete that layer. Select the new top layer, go to the environment, make sure the altitude range is set -1 to +1, and we're going to load in one of the lower variations I had created. And I made 2 of them just to have extra options, little bits of changes in the gnarl amount. You don't necessarily have to always do that, and you don't always have to create so many variations as well. We could also just use the mid object, the second layer we have right now of ecosystem, to cover the entire tree. But I like to have as much realism as possible if I'm going to be using this sort of a material. I'm going to go back and turn off that previous layer, the mid option, so that we can really focus on just the lower. We can go ahead and populate it, increase our density to 100%, force regular alignment, and now we see these very long cascading sets of leaves. Go ahead and zoom out, go to the General tab, turn on full quality in your camera at 3 meters so we can zoom in close and really take a look. And we can see that cascading effect looks really nice with all of our leaves. And we have all of these hanging down as opposed to our other ones, which are covering more the mid areas and protruding upward from our branches, which is why I like to create these variations, and that way we can cover the bottom parts of our object and branches without having to use the rotation value, because then we will have flipped leaves and the cascading effect will not look as realistic. And there is one other thing that is really important when using this method, and that is the color. I'm going to go ahead and turn on billboard for all of our different layers. And we can already see within the OpenGL preview that we have some color variation. Now, this is built into the ecosystems for basically every single plant has a built-in color variation. Now, sometimes that's going to give you a result that is not realistic looking, because most trees will have a very consistent green unless you're working on autumn leaves, but even then the amount of variation changes in large scale throughout the tree and not just every little group. Now, in order to see that, we will need to create a little bit of a render, and I am going to lighten up our scene a little bit, and increase our sky dome lighting gain, and increase our artificial ambience. And if we go to the Sky, Fog, and Haze tab, I just want to increase our glow intensity and decrease the scattering, and that will brighten up the darker areas of our tree. Set this to broadcast, and I have it at 800 by 600. I'm just going to go ahead and render this, and we can take a look and see the color variation and also the density changes that will be needed. Now we can see that those color variations are really showing up where we have the patches of yellow, and it's dispersed not very evenly. It's more concentrated in some areas, but overall it is fairly scattered. And basically, because of the way the Aralia species works, we have lighter leaves on top fading to darker leaves. That's not really what I want. We can also see that the density of all of our leaves together is not quite enough to make this realistic looking. We can see a lot of the branches sticking out, and also we can see our top leaves in some of the areas might be a little too long. We might have to adjust the length on the actual species itself or scale that down. But once we adjust our densities and change the color, this should look really good. So let's go ahead and just close this out, open back up the bark material, and we need to go to our Color tab, and I'm basically just going to be copying the settings over from our color and using the same one on every single ecosystem layer. So we want to check on variable color. I'm in right mouse click and edit our color map. Click the current color, which will allow us to load in whichever color we like. And I have a color already selected and just have kind of saved in our color selector. And the RGB values are 47 for red, 91 for green, and 42 for blue. Click OK, and I'm just going to use that for all of these. And then I'm going to right mouse click, copy the color map, go to our next layer, turn on variable color. We can right mouse click and paste that color map. And just do that for the next one as well. Now, whenever we change color, we need to repopulate our layers and each individual one. And I'm just going to move our camera a little. And you might need to make more changes to that color to get it to look correct with your scene. In this case, it might be too bright of a green. But we're going to go ahead and render that and just take a look at the change with just the color. And now we can tell that we have a very even color throughout. Using the overall color will sometimes still have some of that variation retained within the original color, but it is usually very subtle, and having that color variation there can still be very realistic, because we wouldn't want them all exactly the same color. We would want a very slight variation. And in this case, we do have a nice variation, but overall, our leaves are all the same color, and it looks a lot better. So now let's go ahead and increase those density amounts and really fill the tree in. I'm also going to adjust our lighting settings so we can see this a little better. Maybe move over to another side of the plant where there's some more sun. Go to the atmosphere editor, and under light we can increase the brightness under light intensity, and that should be a little easier to see next time we have a render. We could also zoom in, and I am going to turn on full quality in your camera and make sure it is on for all of our objects and all of our ecosystem layers. So now as we get close, we will be able to see entire sets of branches. And if you need to, you can increase the range of your radius from the camera. But since we're going to be increasing the density, it should show up alright where we're at right now with 3 meters. So we're going to select the density for each one of our options, and I'm going to go ahead and increase this up to 500%. Populate, go to our next layer, 500%, and then our top section, and repopulate. And now we have a really huge coverage of this tree. And you can adjust those different settings, of course, however you want, and really maintain the density that you're looking for by using the same settings throughout each one of the layers. Or you can vary that amount. And we're also going to take a look at using the Environment tab, which is now an extremely important and powerful part of this creation. And I'm just going to go ahead and render out a frame, and we can take a look with the increased density.